Happy birthday, Nintendo Switch. So in case your YouTube feed was not filled with videos talking about this today, the Nintendo Switch has officially turned 4 years old. And honestly, I wanted to make a video talking about the past, present, and the future of the Nintendo Switch, my 4 years with the system. And I realized that, maybe something super structured wasn't how I wanted to go about this. Maybe something a bit more casual, because I feel like the Nintendo Switch is a different system for different people. People get different things out of systems and video games in general. So I wanted to make this a bit more relaxed and a bit more personal because I have had the system since day one. I've been following the system for a very long time, obviously since the initial Nintendo NX rumors and things of that nature, because I was working at editor-in-chief at Nintendo Enthusiast at the time. So I was covering a lot of this stuff leading up to the system itself. I was there for the Wii U era as well. So I feel like I could sort of offer a different perspective than a lot of other people can when it comes to the Nintendo Switch. What's going on, guys? I'm RGT85. If this is your first time on the channel, welcome. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and be sure to like the video. But without any further ado, let's talk about the Nintendo Switch, the 4 years we've had the system, the past, present, and the future of what the Nintendo Switch brings to the table. So before the Nintendo Switch was of course unveiled during a YouTube trailer, there was lots of speculation on what the Nintendo NX, which was known at the time, was actually going to be. Like I said, I was editor-in-chief over at Nintendo Enthusiast at the time, so we were doing all sorts of stuff. There were so many leaks and potential rumors circulating around. There was the Stewie Griffith controller, but one thing we did not know about the Nintendo Switch was what the system was actually going to be. You see, after the Nintendo Wii U, Nintendo fans kind of wanted something different because the Wii U just didn't work out well. It only sold 13 million systems, and Nintendo and third-party companies quickly abandoned this system to show that this wasn't the direction that they necessarily wanted to go into. Now, leading up to the unveiling of the Nintendo Switch, there were two trains of thoughts going with the system. It was either going to be this hybrid system that had been rumored, or it was going to be a powerful system, much like something we saw with the GameCube. And I'll be honest with you guys, I wanted that powerful GameCube system more so than I wanted the hybrid system. I remember the exact time and date of when the Nintendo Switch was unveiled, where they did that trailer on YouTube. I was working at my day job and I told my boss, I was like, yo, I gotta watch this trailer because, I'm gonna have to talk about this when I get home, blah, blah, blah. He was super cool. So he let me watch that video, and I remember watching that initial unveiling video and just feeling gutted. I felt so disappointed because it wasn't this powerful system. It was this hybrid system, and I really didn't understand it. And I feel like for a lot of Nintendo Switch owners nowadays, when you first saw that trailer, you probably didn't quite understand what this system was actually going to do and how it was going to sort of impact how Nintendo was going to move forward with systems and games in general. Now, of course, I got over those initial feelings. I was like, well, I still want the system, even though maybe it's not tailor suited to what I wanted at that time. I pre-ordered it from Best Buy. I got Breath of the Wild as well. I remember standing in line for it. Once I got home and unboxed everything and started playing with it, I sort of had that moment of realization that I did understand what this was doing. And for me, it was sort of like a Nintendo DS effect, because when the Nintendo DS first came out, I really didn't have much interest in it. Like, I was like, oh, that's kind of neat, a little novelty thing. It's got a touch screen, 2 screens. I don't really understand that, but it's kind of cool, I guess. And I remember my best friend at the time, his girlfriend actually bought him a Nintendo DS when it first came out. And so I went over to his house and he was playing it, and I was like, yeah, that's kind of cool. And then he let me play the Metroid Prime Hunters demo. And when Samus was on the bottom screen and then she stood up and went to the top screen, like, that was a moment for me. That's a moment in video games that I will never forget, because it was almost like that Super Mario 64 moment. The first time I played Super Mario 64, I was like, holy crap, this is the craziest thing I've ever seen. And seeing that sort of transformation from the bottom screen to the top screen, everything just sort of clicked with the Nintendo Switch at that point in time with me. It was something that I needed to experience in my hands more so than seeing what these trailers were doing. And of course, it had a slow launch lineup. You had Breath of the Wild, which was essentially a Wii U game. You had Super Bomberman R, 1-2 Switch. It wasn't the greatest launch lineup in the world, so success was not necessarily guaranteed with this system. And I feel like a lot of people were a bit hesitant at first to sort of jump into the Nintendo Switch, but then Nintendo did something that they probably should have done with the Wii U, and that was just have a huge explosion of software. It started in the summer of 2017, and honestly, it really hasn't slowed down since. You had fan favorite franchises such as Xenoblade, Kirby, Smash Brothers, Animal Crossing, Luigi's Mansion, Super Mario Odyssey. You had new IPs coming to us with games like Astral Chain and ARMS. But I think the most important thing when it comes to the Nintendo Switch was the return of third-party companies. And a lot of third-party companies just completely abandoned the Wii U, and because of this, there were huge droughts when games were coming out. Nintendo was relying on these third-party companies to sort of fill in the gap as they were getting used to HD gaming. You gotta remember, the Wii U was the Nintendo's first foray into the world of HD gaming because the Wii was not an HD console. And once these third-party companies left, Nintendo was left with this huge gaping hole of just no games. You had small indie games, but that wasn't really a way to sort of get people to buy a Wii U. But they really sort of rectified this with the Nintendo Switch by having these heavy hitters right at the start of the system and continuing to go on through that. Now in 2018, of course, we saw the introduction of Nintendo Labo, which was this cardboard creation from Nintendo. I think Nintendo is literally the only company that can sell you cardboard for $80, and people are like, oh, okay, yeah, you know, I'll check it out. Obviously, I was not super good at Labo. I couldn't really do it or anything like that. You know, I never really got to fully experience Labo, but it was an interesting experiment for Nintendo to sort of try to bring like a different stratosphere into the Nintendo Switch, these different ideas and these different sorts of gameplay mechanics that you could necessarily only experience with this special cardboard that Nintendo was making. I wasn't a huge fan of Nintendo Labo, but I do think it was somewhat impactful into how Nintendo was sort of doing things with the Switch, trying different things to see if maybe some of these things would catch on. In 2019, we of course saw the introduction of a new piece of hardware in the Nintendo Switch family with the Nintendo Switch Lite, which I mean, really wasn't a Nintendo Switch. It was a Nintendo Switch Lite, a portable only Nintendo Switch that you could not hook up to your television, but it did come at a discounted price of $199.99. Now, the obvious reason as to why Nintendo did this system was because of the fact that, yes, there has not been a dedicated handheld since the Nintendo 3DS, and they've pretty much phased that sort of thing out. Now, if you want a handheld Nintendo system, it is a Nintendo Switch, but some people didn't want to pay that $300 price point. Of course, the Nintendo Switch Lite has been selling very well. There's been a couple variants. Of course, the Nintendo Switch Lite has been selling pretty well. I'm kind of surprised Nintendo hasn't done more color variants of this system because I feel like it's something that people would sort of want to collect low-key. You know, they came out with the 3 different colors, the gray, the turquoise, and the yellow, and then they would just kind of like, we're like, okay, you know, those are the colors of the system. I really feel like that's something they could expand upon potentially in the future, maybe when technology costs go down lower and they can even price this system lower. But it was an interesting thing to see Nintendo introduce new hardware. And then of course we have 2020, where the whole world just pretty much went to shit and everything was completely turned upside down. But I think Nintendo still managed to do a good job in terms of software for the Nintendo Switch. Yes, it was definitely a very slow start, but you got games like Animal Crossing, which is one of the best-selling Nintendo Switch games to date. I honestly feel like this will end up being the best-selling game of all time, and it's only been a year since this game came out, and it's already sold over 30 million copies. You had games like Super Mario 3D All-Stars, the celebration of Super Mario for his 35th anniversary. We of course had a new Paper Mario game, Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. It definitely was a slow start to the year, but I feel like Nintendo really managed to keep up momentum and keep up the pace of things with new game releases, and they ended up doing a stellar job of it, especially in the face of these new consoles, such as the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. Everyone's talking about these systems, yet the Nintendo Switch is still outselling these systems more often than not, and of course some of that is due to supply constraints, but a lot of that has to be accredited to the fact that Nintendo Switch has all of this software, whereas the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X, especially the Xbox Series X, doesn't have that exclusive software right now. So we've talked about the past of the Nintendo Switch, obviously leading up to the present day. And when you look at the Nintendo Switch in present day, one thing is for sure, right now, even in the face of the PlayStation 5, even in the face of the Xbox Series X, the Nintendo Switch has the best lineup of 2021 games that we know about so far. And this is really just for the first part of the year. Look at games that have a concrete release date on the Nintendo Switch that are exclusive games to the system. We, of course, have games like Mario Golf, we have Skyward Sword HD, Monster Hunter Rise, which technically is a year timed exclusive going to PC, but it is a console exclusive, new Pokemon Snap, No More Heroes 3. All of these games already have release dates. When you look at something like the PlayStation 5, right now there are only 3 games that have a concrete release date. We have Returnal, which I think looks like a decent game, but I'm not quite sure it's going to be a day one for me. We have Ratchet and Clank in the month of June, which does look absolutely fantastic, and we have Kenna that comes out in August. But those are the only 3 games we know about that are exclusives that have concrete release dates. So you have to imagine that maybe that's only the games that are going to come out on the PlayStation 5 in terms of exclusives between now and August. Looking at the Xbox Series X, we have Flight Simulator coming out this summer, and maybe Halo Infinite coming out at the tail end of the year. So somehow, some way, Nintendo has managed to sort of supersede these new consoles, supersede all of this new technology just by releasing software on the system that has been selling very well for them. Let's be realistic, the Nintendo Switch has sold over 80 million systems in just 4 years on the market, which is outtrending things like the PlayStation 4 and the Nintendo Wii. This could end up being one of the most popular selling systems of all time, and I definitely think it will be. So the rebound effect is absolutely amazing, and I think the present day looks absolutely fantastic for the Nintendo Switch. And then, of course, we have to talk about the future of the Nintendo Switch, and I think that's where things get the most interesting with this system. So Nintendo's president Furukawa has, of course, said that we are reaching the halfway life cycle of the Nintendo Switch system. And yes, 2021 does look like a stellar year. We've already talked about the games that we know about thus far, but there's so many other things that we don't know about, such as the second half of 2021. Obviously, there's going to be more stuff like Zelda games coming to the Nintendo Switch. Could we see Breath of the Wild 2? I definitely think it's a possibility. What other sort of games does Nintendo have up their sleeve for the holiday season? There's 2 big Nintendo exclusive games that we know about that we still don't have release dates for, with games like Bayonetta 3 and Metroid Prime 4. Could one of those games potentially see a 2021 release? So I think 2021 looks absolutely stellar for the Nintendo Switch, but beyond that, things get a little bit concerning. If we are at the halfway point of this system's life cycle, that means that we have at least 4 more years to go with the Nintendo Switch hardware as it stands today. And that's where I kind of start to question things. Nintendo is the king of getting the most out of their hardware. I mean, look at some of the stuff that they did on the freaking Wii, but when first-party titles are starting to show some age, it should be a bit of a cause of concern. You gotta remember, Bowser's Fury only ran at 30 frames per second when it was in handheld mode versus 60 frames per second when it was docked. And yes, of course, more than likely that was because of the fact that it would drain your battery fast, but still, that's something to consider when you're talking about hardware. Look at one of the games that came out in 2017 with Xenoblade Chronicles 2. There were some huge dips in the resolution in handheld mode. And of course, more recently with Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, there were huge frame rate drops when you were playing this game in docked mode and in handheld mode on this system. If we are having these issues now and some of the cracks are starting to show with the actual hardware of the system, in 2-3 years, will this hardware still be competent enough to run first-party Nintendo Switch games, and more importantly, third-party multi-platform games in a reasonable and respectful manner? I think we really have to look at the other side of Nintendo's business model that has been completely abandoned now, and that is the handheld side of things. Nintendo always refreshed their handhelds. Game Boy to Game Boy Pocket to Game Boy Color, things like the Game Boy Advance to the Game Boy Advance SP, the Nintendo DS to the Nintendo DSi, the 3DS to the new 3DS. These were system enhancements that were done to sort of preserve these games and make these games still run great and even potentially better. I think the new 3DS is the most interesting piece of hardware because of games that were designed sort of with it in mind. You could play a game like Hyrule Warriors Legends on your 3DS, but it looked so much better and ran so much better on your new Nintendo 3DS. When you look at the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X right now, obviously they are still relying heavily on the last generation. Games like Horizon Forbidden West are still coming out on the PlayStation 4. Third-party companies are making multi-platform releases that go across most of the systems, the Xbox One, the PlayStation 4, and the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. Things like that can help elongate the Nintendo Switch's life cycle because of the fact that they don't have to worry about these games being designed with a PlayStation 5 or an Xbox Series X in mind, and they are obviously struggling in terms of power. A mid-generation refresh could potentially help elongate this life cycle because as it stands, I don't really see the standard Nintendo Switch hardware that we have right now lasting another 4 years. All in all though, it's been a very interesting 4 years from Nintendo, a complete 180 from looking like they were going to leave the console industry and, you know, become the laughing stock of everyone to now being one of the most successful systems of all time with the Nintendo Switch. And I think the next few years are going to be very interesting in terms of things like hardware, in terms of things like software, in terms of things of how Nintendo can elongate this life cycle. When you look at their handheld versus console life cycle, the console life cycle is usually about half as long as the handheld life cycle. And I think most of the indicators that we've seen so far with the Nintendo Switch go to show you that Nintendo, while yes, it is a hybrid console, they are sort of treating it like a portable console, a handheld console, in terms of how they do business with it, in terms of things like different variants of it. And I think it's going to be a very interesting next 4 years with this system. But I just wanted to share with you guys my thoughts on the Nintendo Switch, the past, present, and future, my sort of lead up to this system. And I don't know, maybe this video is interesting to you. If you stuck around to the end, you are a trooper because I'm looking at how long I've recorded so far and looks like this is going to be a pretty long video. But I want to know what your thoughts are on the 4 years of the Nintendo Switch, what things you've enjoyed with the system, what things you haven't enjoyed with the system, how you look at the present, and most importantly, how you look at the future of the Nintendo Switch, because I think it's going to be very interesting. And as always, guys, thank you for checking out this video. If you are new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Be sure to check out other videos on the channel as well, and as always, I will catch you guys on the next one. Later.